Welcome to Cross-Border Tax Talks, where we discuss the latest trends in international taxation, from Biden's tax proposals to promoting diversity in the tax profession. I'm Doug McHoney, PwC's U.S. International Tax Services Leader. You can follow me on Twitter at XBorderTax. On this week's episode of Cross-Border Tax Talks, I'm excited to be joined by PwC's U.S. Tax Leader, Kathryn Kaminsky. Kathryn has over 25 years of experience as an assurance partner, including leading our New York Metro office before taking over the role of Vice Chair Tax Leader. She's also on the board of the United Way of New York City. Kathryn, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Doug. I'm really excited to be here.
Me too. I'm excited to have you, Kathryn. It's been a long time coming. It's been a crazy 9-10 months since you've joined us as U.S. Tax Leader. March was Women's History Month, and I wanted to start because you're a big advocate for women in the profession, and you recently hosted a webcast for the tax practice that included your mom. It was awesome. Can you start by talking about your experience as a woman in the tax profession and the role your mom played as a role model?
Sure, thanks. You know, it's interesting. I always talk about being brave and doing things a bit differently. And so I thought doing the episode with my mom was going to be interesting, but the feedback actually has been really heavy, and she's so proud. So my mom still works. She's, got 3 kids, 8 grandkids. She still travels. She could have kept up with you, Doug, and you're traveling. And just a real advocate on how important it was for all of us to work and to take care of ourselves and be sort of motivated by a lot of different things, and very supportive. And I think what was important is my dad still works also, that she supported him, she supported us. And she has a really big mantra of Kaminsky's don't quit. And so when things get tough, they're there for us, but you got to keep focused and keep going. And so seeing her and everything that she did, very interesting. We didn't talk about this part of it, but she had come over. She's South African. They moved to the UK and had me and my brother, and then moved to Canada. She did teaching English as a second language. And believe it or not, Ottawa has this community of technology, and she saw that as people were working on the lines, like building technology and building, it was more hardware than software, that they couldn't understand the stuff to follow, because it was written for someone who was an English first speaker. And so she created this company that started with that, and sort of now is a big cultural diversity training organization. And so just all really, really interesting. And she's been really fundamental to sort of me working and also raising my brothers, who are both extremely protective of both their wives and extremely supportive and of me and her. She's got 7 boy grandchildren who she does diversity training with all the time. So it's quite funny. So it was great. It was really fun.
Yeah, I think, historically, the accounting profession has been male dominated, and particularly the tax profession, both within public accounting and the legal profession. What has your experiences been like as you've transitioned from assurance to tax as a woman in the profession? And what I'm really interested in, Kathryn, is what can I do? What can we do as men in the profession to be advocates for women and to try to encourage additional diversity within the profession?
It's such a great question. I think it's even more important now, Doug, being in this pandemic environment. So the first thing that I always say is, don't ever make assumptions and always ask, right? So look, if someone had made an assumption about me, an assurance partner with 3 younger kids, would she do tax? What would be luckily Tim asked, and people ask the question. So that would be the first thing. Don't make assumptions. Ask people if they want to do things, and are they willing to take risks, and don't just assume, because I think we do have a lot of assuming. Secondly, I would say advocacy and mentorship are very different, right? People need both. A mentor is just what working with the person to see what they can do next, being supportive. Advocacy and sponsorship is pushing them to do something that maybe is a bit outside of their comfort zone, but then be supportive, help them, right? Once you put them in a role that might be a stretch role, make sure that we know that you're there to help us and it's a safe space to ask questions. And then lastly, and I think this has been really important for me, is that you need to make sure that you give them space in a room, right? One of the things that we read a lot about is a woman's voice sometimes doesn't get heard, and an idea will come out of a woman's mouth, and then the man will say the same thing. And sometimes everyone's like, that's a great idea. And we all kind of laugh about that. But I think it's instead of, I've seen some really great behaviors lately and said, well, Kathryn just said da 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 da. And I think some of that stuff really helps. And then the last thing is, I think being truthful about if you've done something right or wrong and giving them the feedback. And we talk about feedback all the time, but it is hard to give feedback. But I am telling you, my most advocates for me have had some pretty tough conversations with me, and I remember them. And I think we need to keep doing that. So those are the main things I would say, Doug. I think it's so important in a male-dominated space that the man really do work and work with our women. And I think we're seeing it, but we can always use more.
Yeah, I remember, it seems like a long time ago when I was in our Cincinnati practice and was a brand new partner and was building my team in Cincinnati, looking to hire, associates and interns and really starting at the beginning. And I remember having conversations, particularly with our, young women in the practice, and wanted to make sure that they understood that their career paths would not be inhibited by the desire to want to have a family and to want to have children. And I remember that being a difficult conversation. And I think what I wanted to do was make sure that, women that were just starting a family that wanted to say, well, what are your longer term goals? And, thinking about a path that may be less traditional than what we would see for a man, right, in the practice, and that paths may be different, particularly for a woman that would want to spend more time focusing on family, maybe earlier, when the kids are younger. Do you have any advice or reaction to that? And as far as I felt like it was a best practice, just acknowledging that, listen, people can have different paths. And it goes to your point, which really resonated with me, is that you need to ask people. And I realized that very early on. And as I've kind of moved up and instead of frankly working with associates, now working with partners, that it's just how important it is to talk to, and this isn't unique to women, right? Just each person is going to have a different path, but any reaction to that and advice for people as they're having those conversations and trying to be a mentor and an advocate for women?
Yeah, I think it's really important. I think I'd say two things on that. One is like the honesty of the conversation really matters. And also saying like there's different paths to do things, but also to make sure that people aren't taking the path of the least resistance, where there's a thought, oh, I should take a step back because that's what's expected of me. And so to say, like, we're going to work with you. We're going to make this all work. We saw it, and we talked about this on another podcast, is that when PwC offered more flexibility for people, during this time, our HR teams came back with the statistics. And I don't think this will surprise you, Doug, but the statistics were very heavily weighted to women asking for more time off. And it felt funny a little bit. And so what we decided we would do is have one-on-one conversations with many of these women and say, like, what are you asking for? And when we did those conversations, what we realized is that a lot of what was being asked for, they already had today. We have flexibility as a firm, but people are a little worried to take it for some reason. And we have to figure out why, and we're spending time on that. But after we had those conversations, the numbers went down significantly because we spent time looking at their schedules, figuring it out. And I think those conversations are really important. And then the second point that you made is so true, is like, people make different choices, and there's on ramps, there's off ramps. We need everybody. That's part of our process and how we work. And we need to have that conversation and explain to people what it can look like so that you can sort of go up and down based on different times in your career. So I would say the first part of that conversation, though, is exactly what you said, is what are you looking for? Because sometimes you'd be surprised the person may be looking for something totally different than you expected.
Yeah, and I also think, and I didn't mean to glance over that for dads too, and particularly for new dads, I see a lot more of the conversation as well, insofar as new dads taking time off, and some of the, I think, maybe historic stereotypes in that respect, that a lot of families are maybe non-traditional in that respect, and it's important to have that conversation, I think, both with new moms and new dads, to really understand what expectations are, and just making sure, because we know that people can work through this and be successful over the course of their careers.
Absolutely. And I think like both those conversations help both people. Like I have a husband that also still works, and we balance it. Like he's had to have conversations, to your point exactly, right? Like that will help everybody if the conversation's happening with both men and women, because you don't know what happens in everybody's house. And so you're 100% right. You're 100% right. And there's pressure on everybody today right now with kids, especially with the pandemic, where people's, what are children doing? Where are they living? Where are they working? Where are they going to school? Like, it's just a lot. So I totally agree, Doug. It's a conversation that has to happen with every person right now.
All right, so I wanted to turn next to your role as an auditor, and your background, I should specifically say, as an auditor. So we've spent a lot of time. I think this is our 71st podcast, and you're the first auditor that we've had on the podcast. And as you well know, we spend a lot of time here on the Cross Border Tax Talks talking about a lot of really nerdy, wonky, international tax specific topics. But when I joined this profession, I have an accounting background and then went to law school, and kind of thought I would take the more traditional legal path, and then decided I wanted to specialize in international tax, and started my career with PwC. And frankly, I went to law school, Kathryn. I don't know if I've acknowledged this publicly. I think maybe on one of my vlogs, that I went to law school because I didn't want to be an accountant, and then ended up working with PwC, and 22 years later, here I am. But have obviously, over the course of my career, learned a lot about the accounting rules, and working with our clients on the provision and audit side of the business. Can you talk a little bit about your experience as an auditor working on tax provisions, and then any best practices that you have, both for practitioners, auditors, as well as our clients?
Sure. This is fun because I haven't been able to talk about my auditing job for a while. So I would say a few things, Doug. One is that it's like I'll start internally, and then I'll start sort of to the client side. Internally, on the tax provision, the tax partner and the audit partner need to be attached at the hip, and they need to understand the issues, and they needed to do early escalation of any issues that come up. And I think that, planning process, and I always talk about it from forward looking, because there's lots of different things that go into a tax provision with lots of judgment. Rules can change, results can change based on sort of IRS recommendations, IRS white paper, all the stuff that goes into that. Is that I spend a lot of time going through each different thing and say, where's the risk? What matters? What does it look like from, conservative to not conservative? And where's it all going to end up? And trying really hard, Doug, and this will make you smile, to not talk about it in a code sense. Talk to me about it as to what is the unknown? Like, why am I putting up a valuation allowance? What is the reserve for? What are we thinking about? Just so that I understand we're both talking about the same risk aspects to it. And then there's just the technical, like, how do you audit it? Where does it come from? And one of the things that I believe has always been incredibly helpful is making sure that the tax director actually understands a little bit the auditing rules. And so we sit down every year with our tax director and go through, like, what issues have come up under, the regulatory when our regulator comes in and publicly, across all the firms gives out the points as to where there's risk and what hasn't gone well, we pull those together and share them with the tax team and say to the tax team, like, are we thinking about this right? So, because the client has to help us get to the right answer. And we have a little bit of a roadmap. So let's use the roadmap. And I'm very focused on communication, communication, communication. We never want surprises. And in public companies, you get every quarter. So every quarter we do planning, we talk about what we're going to look at. And then to me, transparency is so important. And we don't wait, right? My big thing I keep telling, and I work this way across everything, is if you know of something happening, don't wait to talk to me in our quarterly meeting, and don't wait. Like, let's talk about it early. Let's communicate it early and be transparent, because we can help you much earlier in the system, and we can make it much less painful if we know about the issue early. And then lastly, I do always believe in forward looking, because although the provision is backwards looking, it's too late if we're dealing with the issue during, year end. Let's think about dealing with it. Like, what next year do we have to worry about and start tracking? And so those are the things that I would say have worked quite well. And then just also escalation of issues, making sure that we're respectful. Like, I always try to be very careful to make sure that I understand the issue. My tax partner understands it. The tax director, me and the tax partner understand it. And until we've had that communication and we feel comfortable, we wouldn't go any further. And then we go through the escalation process if it is an issue. And those are all sort of hints of, I think, how it can work really nicely, because it is a stressful time and it's a really, really important number.
Yeah, I like communication and transparency. I think is going to be a big theme of this
Yeah.
podcast because it's really important. One point I did want to unpack is the being able to try to explain things, particularly for the non-tax professionals, the auditors, and we'll talk a little bit later about engaging it with the C-suite. But one of the things that is increasingly difficult, obviously, the field of international taxation, that the specific niche, has always obviously been a very, very technical field. And I think one of the challenges that we have as tax advisors is that it's only getting more complicated. And we spent a lot of time talking about the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, right? We've got the Biden tax proposals and potentially U.S. tax reform right in front of us. But trying to communicate some of these nuanced technical issues is really challenging. And I think that's what's really important for us is we've got to figure out ways to be able to communicate that. And oftentimes, a model or a spreadsheet or the numbers often resonates with people kind of outside of tax. But I've just found it particularly even more challenging being able to communicate things. I mean, frankly, even to those within tax, it's so complicated. Then you have to start explaining to, non-tax people about the intricacies of a particular regulation or whatever. And it's just, it's very challenging to understand or to help people understand what those complexities are.
Yeah, and you know what's really interesting, Doug, if you think about just a timeline, especially in a public company, right? The audit partner only sits on the account for 5 years, right? And
Yeah.
so you also have to remember that, because I think you and I have talked about this, like guilty, beat, you guys, the terms get thrown out all over the place, which is important. But if you remember, like, the partner coming on after me wouldn't have been around at that company during TCJA. And so if you can't like base premise like what it means, right? You're there, that partner's getting a conversation like in the middle of the conversation, right? Because now we're talking about guilty and beat in
Right.
the new world, what it could look like. But you actually have to understand the old world before you do that. And I would say it's not just the audit partners this happens to. If you think CFOs also change a lot more than tax directors change. And so I always sort of say, stop. You got to give me a bit of a history lesson, right? And not in code talk, like the way you did it to me, Doug,
Mm-hmm.
about something where you're like, Kath, this is the implications. This is why it matters now versus what it mattered then. But just so you know, there's still old stuff coming, right? So I think that to me is something that I think sometimes gets lost in the conversation, is that a lot of times audit partners and CFOs have not been there for the history lesson, and we get sort of thrown in the middle. And so I would always recommend spending a few minutes just saying, just so this is a bit of the history of what's happening, and this is why it's going to have such bigger implications. Does that make sense?
It does, and the one follow up to that is I think that you can get tax professionals can get better at that with practice. And so the example that I give was earlier in my career. I think I was a manager with the firm, and I taught in a master's in tax program for a local university. For almost all of my students were people that were getting their masters in accounting or masters in tax. They were kind of later in their career, sort of non-traditional students, people who just did not have a deep history or technical background in tax. But what that experience did was that it forced me to drop a lot of the jargon and be able to explain things to people about how our international tax rules worked. And it was great practice in hindsight, where I would have, these 20 faces looking at me. They had no idea. This was pre-TCJA, well before the TCJA. But I remember the very first time I taught that course, I got at the end of the semester and I was like, I don't think these people have any idea what I'm actually talking about. And I had to really go back and adjust. And what I tell our younger folks is that takes practice, like learning how to communicate this stuff, this really highly complex stuff, to people that aren't into the weeds, just takes practice. And so whether it's you can do trainings or teaching or something like that, it's just you need to practice doing that, because as you work up in your career, and now I have a lot more conversations with CFOs certainly than I did back then, and those things that I learned teaching that night school master's in tax program has really helped me in communicating. And I will also acknowledge sometimes I'll throw out the code sections and the acronyms more than I should. But I think like anything else, you can practice at that and get better at communicating in non-technical manner.
I agree. And I think like it's all of us, right? Even for me, like the conversations between the CFO and then the conversations with the board, I've had to practice. They're very, like, for accounting matters and tax matters, because they're very different. And I think that's part of the fun of being in client service, to be honest with you, Doug, is your agility comes through, right? Your conversations with, like, a day I may have a conversation with an intern, and then I may be at a CEO, and then I may be at a board, and they're all very different. And I think that's the fun part, in my opinion. And you're right, you can change. And it's also just being able to listen to the feedback so that you can change. So I agree with you 100%.
Well, I want to move on to your transition to your role as tax leader. And, people at all levels are often asked to pivot during their careers into different roles, right? I'm talking about from the associate level all the way to the very experienced senior professional. So as you've transitioned into the U.S. tax leader role, there's been a whole lot of change in the world we live in. I think of from the reemergence of the Black Lives Matter movement to the pandemic, to a new administration and a democratically controlled Congress. What has been challenging for you about the transition from audit practice to the tax practice, and what can we learn from your experiences over the last 9 months in the tax practice?
Yeah, you said it so well. Lots of challenges. I would say the number one challenge is it's doing it through a screen. I am a very much like, I like being in a room with people. I like getting to know people, and that's it's hard doing it through a screen. But yet on the other hand, like, we've done it, right, Doug? Like, I feel like I know you, and I feel like I know my team, and I can't wait to be able to sort of really be with the team. So that's one is a big challenge. Secondly, and I'll say it honestly, is there's like the other challenge is that I think people assumed and that I didn't know anything about tax. And I do know tax, and I think that I'm not, can I do a code section? No, but I've been in client service my whole career dealing with tax, both from a consulting sort of side of helping the client, from a provision side, and then also from a pure compliance side. I work with, I spent a lot of time in the asset management space. And so making sure that people didn't start with the premise that I knew nothing was also sometimes a challenge. And every now and again, I'd have to say, like, you don't have to explain deferred tax asset to me. I kind of get it, right? And what a should opinion looks like. And then the last thing I would say is I really worry about our people. And you went through everything that's gone on in the last year. And you also mentioned at the beginning that I was at the New York MMP. And in that role, a year ago, we shut down our offices. And that, from a leadership perspective, was a very different thing for me, because all of a sudden you're worried about the safety of your people, not just this, are people getting a good learning experience? Are they, getting enough time off? This was like a very different thing of like making sure people were safe. And so I think for me, now moving with our tax teams to constant busy season, being very busy, working, the provision, then doing compliance and working on consulting projects and being out in the market virtually. I do think that's another big thing that I've been quite worried about, is our people, and how do we make sure our people are motivated and feel that we have their backs during this time. So all those things have sort of been a big challenge for the last sort of 7 or 8 months. But I'm really enjoying it. And I think that we're getting to the right answer. We're focused on our people, we're focused on our clients, and we're focused on each other and checking in a little bit on each other as well. Our partners also need the empathy during this time. They have families, they have, parents. And so all of that together has been a big challenge during this, to show it all virtually that we really do care.
Right, and I will call out that you use the first acronym as MMP, which is the managing
Oh,
partner, the
sorry.
market, the mark. Well, I thought I was going to be the first one, for the record, Kathryn, to use an acronym, but I just want to highlight that for our listeners. That was the market managing partner position, and yeah, I mean, obviously a huge practice and a lot to manage. As you've transitioned and as you've built your team, you talk about screens and just that having to do all of this remotely. And I've been working with you for 9 months. It's crazy to think that we've never actually been in a room together at this point since you've taken over that role. Do you have any suggestions? And I mean, the hope is, I think we'll all end up back in an office at some point. And I think obviously PwC, as well as the rest of corporate America, is thinking through the post-pandemic, what it's going to look like from a work perspective. But I think if there's one thing that we know, it's going to be different than it was pre-pandemic. The days of us spending 5 days in the office, and frankly, the days where I was gone 5 days a week, probably are over, right? And it's going to be some combination of remote working and working from home. As you've been building your team and getting to know partners and working with partners like myself, who we just didn't work a ton together before this, what's worked well for you? What maybe hasn't worked well? Are there any kind of best practices in this remote world that you've seen as you've been building and growing and developing your team?
Yeah, I mean, I am a big believer in the screen, in the face to face, to be able to see people. But I've also learned some people aren't as engaged in that, and so trying to balance that a little bit. Um, but I do think screens matter. I think seeing people's facial reactions, like it's funny, Doug. I had to do a call the other day, and I was driving back from I had been away for a weekend, and I didn't go on screen for the call. And I have to tell you, like, I felt it was so weird, because you don't see the expression and you don't feel as you're sort of completely part of the meeting. So we also have to fix that a little bit, because we can't forever be on screens. And so how do you balance making sure people feel part of the call? But I am a big screen. I laugh. Like, my team will tell you, I FaceTime them. They've never seen that before. They think it's so funny. And I just, it's hard now not having the screen. The other thing is the working environment of how do you do it. And so I asked my other team, who worked, the associates and seniors, how they work together to get to get an audit done, right? How do you get, or to get a task done? And you know what they were doing, which I actually think is really incredible, is they spent a lot of time where, instead of sending all the questions through, like, you'd spend 2 days a week with the screen on, for a few hours, and just work. And then they just pop up their head and ask a question. So it felt like they were in a room together. Because remember, they tend to sit in bullpens, sit beside each other. And I like, did you like that? They're like, we did, actually, because we also would laugh every now and again because something would happen. But that's how they did it, to get away from like sending zillions of questions. And I thought that was really interesting. And then the other thing that I've seen and that I try to do is, there are days where you do need to just get work done. And so I block times on my calendar to just sit down, put my head down and do the work, and then hope that it'll be sort of time that's a bit quiet to be able to think about things. And then the last thing that we you and I have talked about a little bit is sort of protecting time. Because there is an issue right now that sometimes your home life is your office life. And so I actually do protect time. I have three boys, as you know. We try to have dinner together every night as much as we can. And then we do some family event, whether it be a half-hour Jeopardy show, or we actually, if you can believe it, play Pictionary or charades. And I block an hour every night for at least that, so that no one can touch that time. And all that sort of coming together. I do agree with you, Doug. It's going to look differently, but people will be in an office in some capacity because people really miss the community feel and the culture of an office. We just don't need to do it 5 days a week.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. And I think as I reflect on, I mean, a little over a year ago at this point when, the quarantine started, kind of that first phase, and really encouraging my team to turn their cameras on. And I think for personalities like us, we're both very big extroverts, and just how important that has been for my sanity. Just being able to see people, and so many of the people that I work with are my friends, or my closest friends that I've developed over the last 22 years. And I think some people feel more comfortable, or some people maybe feel less comfortable with the screens on, but I do really think that it's important, and I think that's a trend that's here to stay for sure.
And I think one thing that does come with screens on, Doug, is we also have to be open to the fact that people have lives, right? So, like, I have a dog, I have three kids, I have a husband. I mean, there's sometimes chaos that can happen, and you just don't judge. Like, it's okay if you see a little person come in and out, or a big person come in and out, and just keep going. Do you know what I mean? Because if we can't do it that way, people won't get on screen. That's my view, at least.
Absolutely. And if you listen to enough of my podcasts before I've moved into my new ad hoc podcast studio, you can hear my dogs occasionally contribute to that. And it's just like, that's just a part of it. So whether it's a screaming baby, or a kid, hey mom, hey dad, or my dogs, like, you're right, life happens. And I think we all just have to acknowledge that that's just part of it. All right. So where I wanted to shift to now is, there are some major tax policy changes on the horizon, both in the US and globally. So a really interesting time for you to take over as US tax leader. What is your reaction to those changes, and what conversations have you been having with taxpayers and companies about, the future change? Many of us tax geeks, we waited our whole careers. I waited 20 years for some big tax change, and we're likely going to see two of them now. And I think from the U.S. perspective, and then the stuff that's taking place globally, it's just an amazing dynamic area. So what have those conversations been like as you've transitioned into the role?
So I'm smiling because one of the other things I talk a lot about is intellectual curiosity. And, my background is a bit different. I have a history degree, and I just, I'm smiling because the learning that I've had since in this role around the policy stuff has just been massive. And so one of the things when Tim asked me to take on the role was, I said, I have to be able to also have a huge client face. Like, I want to be able to talk to clients. So I think I'm close to like 180 different CEOs, CFOs, tax directors. And this is the topic, right? There's three general topics. Funny enough, people like to ask me how to work with the CFO because they know I have that bit of a background. Secondly, it is around people and how and tax departments. And then lastly, policy. And so those conversations have been really interesting. It obviously sector specific matters. But the one thing I'll say, and I'm not just saying it because it's you, Doug, is that there is still a significant disconnect between the conversations with the tax directors and the CFOs and CEOs around policy. I think that when you talk to the CFOs and CEOs, they tend to go right to US tax policy, right? Because it was out there, the Biden plan, lots of information, and just think about everything going on during sort of the November all the way through to January time and pre-November. The conversations with tax directors go much, much deeper around international tax and the worry that they have around the GILTI regime, about what's going to happen, honestly, around tax transparency, all those conversations. And they're very deep conversations and a lot of concern around how do I, no regrets plan when you don't really know what planning's going to look like. And so the one thing that I've spent a lot of time talking about is also make sure that you, again, going back to our earlier conversation, don't go into code, but make sure that your CFOs and, even your treasurers and your CEOs have a concept of what's coming from a non-US standpoint, especially for multinationals, because there is a lot of concern about international and what's going to happen. And I think the storytelling there needs to be just as strong as the domestic policy side. So that's one thing I would say that's definitely a big thing, that you don't see the same connection, but the tax directors are on it, they get it. And I think the storytelling up the chain needs to keep happening, especially as more and more things are coming people's way.
Yeah, I feel sometimes that tax can be an echo chamber, with the tax accountants and the lawyers. And to your point, that we love to talk about the various provisions and the nuanced technical speak. And we end up talking to each other a lot. What suggestions do you have, particularly for those at our clients and at companies, to how can they do a better job elevating issues and conversations to the C-suite? Obviously, the C-suite's going to understand, like, hey, there's going to be some policy changes, a corporate rate change. Those things are easier to understand than, as you had mentioned, some of the specific global changes that can be, slightly more nuanced and esoteric. So what suggestions do you have to try to elevate issues to the C-suite?
I think the first thing I would say is making it about the business, right? So you sitting in the room get a sense on what business strategy looks like. And I think sometimes people forget business strategy is really highly impacted by tax. Like, Doug, you've taught me VCT, right? People are talking supply chain all the time. Well, whoever's talking supply chain needs to be talking tax as well. Big implications. Same thing was people are looking at operationally changing their organizations. Tax has a seat at the table and should have a seat at the table because it's probably one of the most important things when it relates to if they're looking at increasing income, like doing good tax planning has a pretty big impact on that. And then also, again, getting engaged early. The things I said earlier, even as it relates to sort of how do you do the provision properly, early communication, transparency, and just sort of saying, look, the more you tell me, the earlier you tell me, the more I can help you. Because tax is a great business partner and can really make an impact. And they need to be able to have the information to be able to do it versus sort of chasing it after the fact. And I think that just selling it that way, that like everything that's done by a company has a tax impact. And a lot of it, the tax director can make that impact really positive and really thinking it through. And I think and it's not just the CFO, the CEO, it's strategy, it's HR, right? People, what are people doing? And that has an impact on tax. So that's what I would say is you put the business lens on it so that you can help the business. And a lot of tax directors are doing that so well, but you have to be transparent and the people have to be transparent with you so you know how you can help. That would be one big thing.
I love it. Every business decision, every single thing that every business decision has a tax implication. I love it. I think we're gonna leave it at that. Kathryn, thank you very much for joining the Cross-Border Tax Talks. This was a long time coming. I really appreciate your insights and everything you're doing, both for women in the practice and really helping elevate the conversation. So thank you.
Thank you. But Doug, I'm going to end it with one thing. You talked about how men can help. I want to give a shout out to you. Right? You've been incredible at making sure, like we do learn, people probably don't know this, I do learning sessions. You talk to me so I can understand. You really have been a great advocate and helper for me in this role. So I did want to say a big thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Kathryn. I appreciate that. So with that, thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of Cross-Border Tax Talks. Thank you to Kathryn Kaminsky, PwC's U.S. tax leader, for joining me today. I'm Doug McHoney, PwC's International Tax Services leader. Stay tuned in 2 weeks for another exciting edition of the Cross-Border Tax Talks podcast.
This podcast is brought to you by PwC, all rights reserved. PwC refers to the U.S. member firm or one of its subsidiaries or affiliates and may sometimes refer to the PwC network. Each member firm is a separate legal entity. Please see www.pwc.com/structure for further details. This podcast is for general information purposes only and should not be used as a substitute for consultation with professional advisors.